The rain had not stopped since dawn. It drummed steadily against the tall glass windows of the Richmond Circuit Courthouse, streaking down in silver lines that distorted the city beyond. From the outside, the building looked cold, formal, and unyielding, a fortress of law made of stone and steel. Inside, however, the air felt heavier than the storm itself. On the fourth floor, Courtroom 7B was packed far beyond capacity. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of anxious families, reporters, legal observers, and strangers drawn in by a case that had shaken the entire state of Virginia. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, casting a pale glow over polished mahogany desks and rows of tense faces. The American flag hung motionless behind the judge's bench, its red stripes looking almost blood-dark under the dim lighting. At exactly 9:02 a.m., Judge Harper entered the room. His footsteps echoed sharply across the tiled floor as he climbed onto the elevated bench. He was a tall man in his late 60s, his hair thinning, his expression permanently etched with the seriousness of someone who had seen too many broken families pass through his courtroom. Adjusting his glasses, he scanned the room slowly, eyes lingering on the jurors, then the lawyers, then the small figure seated near the front row. 3-year-old Maya sat beside her grandmother. She was tiny for her age, her legs barely reaching the edge of the seat. A faded pink dress hung loosely on her frame, slightly wrinkled from hours spent waiting in sterile hallways. Her brown curls were tied back with a small ribbon that had begun to slip. In her hands, she clutched a worn teddy bear, one missing an eye, patched in places, clearly loved far beyond its. Most children her age would have been restless, fidgeting, or crying. Maya was perfectly still. Her eyes were wide, not with innocence, but with something far deeper. Trauma, confusion, fear mixed with an almost unsettling awareness. She stared straight ahead at the courtroom doors as though expecting someone to walk through them at any moment. Her grandmother, Mrs., held her tightly, one hand wrapped around Maya's small shoulder, the other gripping a tissue already soaked with tears. Face was pale, her lips trembling. She had not slept in weeks since her daughter, Maya's mother, disappeared without a trace 3 months earlier. Across the room sat the defendant. Reed, Maya's uncle, dressed in a crisp navy suit that seemed far too polished for a man accused of such unspeakable crimes. His hands rested calmly on the table before him, fingers interlaced. His expression was composed, almost indifferent, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Maya whenever he thought no one was watching. The prosecution team sat stiff and focused. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter shuffled papers methodically, her jaw tight with determination. This case was more than just another trial, it was personal. She had spent months chasing leads, interviewing witnesses, and trying to piece together what had happened to Maya's mother. Yet there was one piece she still could not explain. Maya. No one knew exactly what the child had seen or what she remembered. Psychologists had warned that forcing a 3-year-old to testify could do more harm than good. Defense attorneys argued she was too young to understand truth versus imagination. But Helen insisted Maya held the key, not in words, but in behavior. And that was why the police dog was there. A side door opened quietly. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Officer Daniel Price entered, guiding a large German shepherd on a leash. The dog's name was Ranger, a decorated K-9 officer known across Virginia for solving complex cases. His black and tan coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his posture alert and disciplined. Ranger did not bark. He did not wag his tail. He simply stood beside his handler, eyes scanning the room with calculated intensity. Some spectators leaned forward, confused. Others exchanged whispers. Bringing a police dog into a courtroom was highly unusual, borderline theatrical, according to critics. But Judge Harper had allowed it under strict conditions. Ranger was not evidence, only a support presence. At least, that was what the record would state. Maya shifted in her seat. Her tiny fingers tightened around the teddy bear as Ranger stepped farther into the room. Something changed in her expression. Her stiff stillness softened, replaced by a flicker of recognition. Noticed immediately. "Maya," she whispered gently, "baby, what is it?" Maya did not respond. Her gaze remained locked on the dog. The courtroom grew quieter than before, so quiet that the rain outside seemed louder. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. Judge Harper cleared his throat. "We will proceed." Before anyone could move, Maya slid off her chair. Her small shoes barely made a sound as she stepped onto the cold floor. Reached out instinctively, but Maya slipped from her grasp with surprising speed. Gasps spread across the room. "Ma'am, please keep the child seated," the bailiff called out. But Maya kept walking. Straight toward Ranger. Officer Price stiffened instantly, his hand tightening on the leash. Ranger, however, did not move. His ears perked slightly, but his body remained calm. The jury leaned forward. The defense attorney frowned. Reporters raised their cameras. Maya stopped just inches from the massive dog. For a long moment, child and animal simply stared at each other. Then slowly Maya reached out. Her tiny hand hovered in the air, trembling, before gently resting on Ranger's head. The courtroom froze. Every breath seemed to vanish. Ranger did not growl. He did not flinch. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, almost in submission. Maya's lips parted. Soft, barely audible words escaped her. Not English, not fully formed sentences, but gentle murmurs that sounded more like comfort than speech. Tears welled in his eyes. Helen Carter exchanged a stunned glance with her team. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time since the trial began. A long silence stretched across the room, a silence filled with tension, disbelief, and something deeply unsettling. Then the lights flickered. Just once. Outside, thunder cracked loudly enough to shake the windows. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His calm demeanor vanished. Muscles tensed beneath his fur as his gaze snapped toward the back of the courtroom, toward a sealed wooden door marked Evidence Storage, Authorized Personnel Only. Maya's hand slid from his head. She turned in the same direction. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly now. A quiet whimper escaped her lips. Ranger took one slow step forward. Then another. The leash went slack in Officer Price's hand. The entire courtroom held its breath as the dog began walking, not randomly, but with clear purpose, toward the forbidden door. Maya followed, step by tiny step. Judge Harper slammed his gavel. "Officer, stop that dog immediately." But Officer Price hesitated. Because for the first time in his career, Ranger was not obeying training. He was obeying the child. And as Maya's shadow stretched across the courtroom floor toward that locked door, one terrifying question echoed in every mind. What did she know that no one else did? The courtroom felt suspended in time. Every person inside courtroom 7B seemed frozen, jurors leaning forward, lawyers gripping their pens midair, reporters forgetting to breathe. Even the steady hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim, as if the building itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Ranger continued walking toward the sealed evidence door. His paws moved deliberately across the polished floor, nails clicking softly against tile. The leash dragged loosely behind him, sliding across the ground like a forgotten thread. Officer Daniel Price stood rooted in place, eyes wide with disbelief. He had worked with Ranger for nearly 6 years. They had chased armed suspects through dark alleyways, tracked missing persons across miles of wilderness, and faced dangerous criminals without hesitation. Ranger was trained to obey instantly, precisely, without question. Yet now the dog was following a 3-year-old girl. Maya walked beside him, her small steps matching his steady pace. Her teddy bear dangled from one hand, nearly brushing the floor. Her other hand hovered inches from Ranger's side, as though she needed to feel his presence to stay steady. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. "Is this allowed?" someone murmured. "This is chaos," another voice hissed. Reed shifted in his chair again, this time more noticeably. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His polished composure cracked just enough for those watching closely to notice. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter rose slowly from her seat. "Your Honor," she began, her voice controlled but sharp, "I believe Ranger is reacting to something of evidentiary significance." Defense Attorney Whitman stood instantly. "This is absurd," he snapped. "A dog wandering around with a toddler is not evidence, it's theatrics meant to sway the jury." Judge Harper adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. His gaze moved from the dog to the child to the door, then back to Maya. "Maya," he called gently, his voice softer than before. "Sweetheart, you need to come back to your grandmother." Maya did not stop. Instead, she took another step closer to Ranger. Her lips moved again, whispering something too quiet for anyone to hear. But this time, the murmurs sounded clearer, calmer, almost like a conversation. Ranger's ears perked. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he turned his massive head slightly toward her, as if listening. A collective gasp filled the room. Even seasoned courtroom reporters felt chills run down their spines. Dr. Monroe, the child psychologist seated at the back of the courtroom, leaned forward in her chair. She had studied trauma in young children for over 20 years, but she had never witnessed anything like this. "That dog isn't responding to commands," she whispered to a colleague. "He's responding to her." At last, Ranger reached the evidence door. He stopped directly in front of it. His body stiffened. His tail, which had been still, began to sway slowly. Maya stopped beside him. She placed her tiny palm flat against the wooden surface of the door. The room fell into complete silence. Not even the rain outside could be heard anymore. Officer Price finally snapped out of his shock. "Ranger," he commanded sharply, "heel." Ranger did not move. Ranger heeled now. Still nothing. The handler took a cautious step forward, tugging lightly on the leash. The dog resisted, not aggressively, but firmly, planting his paws as if rooted to the floor. Maya pressed her ear against the door. Her brow furrowed. Her breathing quickened. From her lips came a soft word, clearer this time. "Inside." The word echoed faintly across the courtroom. Burst into tears. Helen Carter's heart began racing. She glanced at the judge, then at the jury, then at the door. Judge Harper leaned forward. "Bailiff, retrieve the child gently." The bailiff moved quickly but carefully toward Maya. As he reached out, Ranger turned his head sharply and let out a low growl, so deep it vibrated through the floor. The bailiff froze mid-step. His hand hovered in the air, inches from Maya's shoulder. Gasps erupted again. "This is out of control," Whitman shouted. "Your Honor, this courtroom has turned into a circus." Before the judge could respond, Ranger moved. Not toward the bailiff. Not toward Maya. Toward the door. His massive body pressed against the wood as he scratched once, then twice, at the bottom seam. A dull thud echoed from inside. Everyone heard it. It was faint but unmistakable. Something or someone had moved behind that door. The courtroom erupted. Jurors stood from their seats. Reporters scrambled for better angles. Screamed Maya's name. Judge Harper slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order, order in this court." But order was impossible. Because the dog, the highly trained police dog, was now barking. Loud. urgent, relentless, and Maya was not afraid. Instead, she stood. Her small face tightened with an emotion far beyond her years, determination. Officer Price's voice trembled as he spoke. "Your Honor, Ranger only behaves like this when he detects a live scent." A stunned silence followed. Helen Carter's pulse pounded in her ears, then opened the door. Whitman objected instantly. "No, this is a violation of procedure." Judge Harper stared at the door, then at Maya, then at Ranger. For a moment, the entire trial, months of arguments, evidence, and strategy, seemed to vanish. All that mattered was what lay behind that door. Finally, the judge spoke. "Bailiff, unlock the evidence room." A key rattled in trembling hands. Metal scraped against metal. The lock clicked. Ranger barked again, louder this time. Maya stepped back slightly, gripping her teddy bear with both hands. The bailiff pushed the door open. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of dust, cardboard, and something faintly metallic. The room was dimly lit, stacked from floor to ceiling with sealed boxes labeled in bold black letters. Evidence, read case. Evidence, THOMPSON disappearance. Forensic material, do not open. Ranger did not hesitate. He lunged inside, dragging the leash from Officer Price's grasp. The handler scrambled after him as cameras flashed wildly. Maya followed again. "No, baby, wait," cried. But the child walked straight into the evidence room. Inside, Ranger moved with precision, weaving through towering stacks of boxes, sniffing the floor, the walls, the corners. Maya trailed behind him, her small footsteps echoing softly. Jurors crowded the doorway. Lawyers pushed forward. Judge Harper remained on the bench, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the gavel. Then Ranger stopped. In a far corner of the room, half hidden behind plastic bins, lay a clear evidence bag. Inside it was a torn pink blanket, the same shade as Maya's dress, the same texture as the fabric had described months earlier. Maya gasped, a sound so raw, so heart-wrenching, that several people in the room began crying instantly. She dropped her teddy bear. Without hesitation, she ran to the blanket. Her tiny hands pressed against the plastic as she collapsed to her knees in front of it. "Mommy," she whispered. The word cracked through the room like lightning. Ranger sat beside her, pressing his body protectively against her side. Helen Carter felt tears sting her eyes. Reed went pale. Whitman opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, unable to find words. Stumbled toward the doorway, sobbing uncontrollably. Maya hugged the plastic bag as if it were a living person, rocking gently back and forth. Then suddenly, Ranger's ears shot up again. He turned sharply, not toward the blanket but toward the far wall. A narrow metal door, almost hidden in shadow, stood ajar. A faint, rhythmic sound drifted from behind it. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Like a heartbeat. Maya lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face turned toward the sound. She stood slowly, still clutching the blanket. Ranger rose beside her. Step by step, child and dog moved toward the smaller door. Behind them, the courtroom watched in paralyzed disbelief. And as Maya reached out toward that hidden door, the chilling thought struck everyone at once. What or who was still alive on the other side? The evidence room felt colder now. Not physically, but emotionally. The air seemed heavier, thicker, almost suffocating, as if something dreadful had been sealed inside these walls for months and was finally waking up. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim fluorescent light, shimmering like silent witnesses. Maya stood motionless in front of the smaller metal door. The rhythmic sound continued behind it. Thumpy pause, thumpy pause. It was subtle but impossible to ignore. Ranger stood rigid beside her, muscles tense, ears pointed forward. His breathing was steady but deep, the kind of alertness he displayed only when a situation was dangerous or deeply significant. Behind them, the courtroom had spilled into the evidence room. Jurors crowded the doorway, some pale, some trembling. Reporters leaned over shoulders, cameras flashing, capturing every second. Lawyers argued in frantic whispers while Judge Harper remained on his bench, watching everything unfold through the open door. Inside the room, Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter took cautious steps forward. Her heels clicked softly against the concrete floor. "Maya," she said gently, kneeling slowly so she was closer to the child's level. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what you hear?" Maya didn't look at her. Her eyes stayed locked on the narrow metal door. Her tiny fingers tightened around the plastic evidence bag containing the torn pink blanket. The edges crinkled loudly in the silent room. "Mommy," Maya whispered again. The word echoed faintly off the walls. Trembling at the doorway, pressed a hand to her mouth. Her knees nearly gave out. Two bailiffs had to steady her before she collapsed. Inside the room, Officer Daniel Price finally caught up with Ranger. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Ranger," he said quietly, voice shaking, "what are you sensing, buddy?" Ranger didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the door. Then suddenly, he stepped forward. One slow, deliberate step. Maya stepped with him. The metal door creaked slightly, as if disturbed by air pressure. Helen Carter rose to her feet. "Officer, do you have the key?" Price shook his head. "This isn't standard evidence storage, this is auxiliary access. Only facilities management should have a key." Before anyone could react, Ranger pushed his nose against the bottom of the door. It shifted. Not locked. Just barely closed. Another faint thump sounded from inside, clearer now. Several jurors gasped. Reed, still seated in the main courtroom, was watching through the open doorway. His composed mask had shattered completely. His knuckles were white as he gripped the table, his jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. His eyes flicked repeatedly between Maya, Ranger, and the metal door. Judge Harper stood up slowly. "This is highly irregular," he said firmly, "but we cannot ignore potential danger or life inside this courthouse. Bailiff, assist the officer." Two bailiffs moved into the evidence room. One of them placed a hand on the metal door handle. He hesitated. His hand trembled. From inside, the sound came again, this time louder. Thump, thump, pause, thump. Not a heartbeat. Something hitting metal. Something weak but alive. Maya stepped closer. Her small hand reached out. Ranger let out a soft whine, not aggressive, not fearful but urgent. "Open it," Helen Carter said quietly. The bailiff swallowed hard and pulled. The door screeched open. Cold air rushed out, carrying a damp, stale smell like old wood mold and something faintly metallic. A narrow stairwell appeared, descending into darkness. No lights. No labels. Just concrete steps disappearing downward. The courtroom gasped as one. Even seasoned detectives felt a chill. Ranger stepped forward immediately, descending the stairs without hesitation. Officer Price followed, drawing his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Maya took one step after them, then stopped. Helen knelt beside her. "You don't have to go down there, sweetheart." Maya looked up at her. For the first time, their eyes met. And in that moment, Helen saw something that shattered her heart, not just fear but memory. Clear, painful memory. Maya took another step. Then another. Helen followed, keeping close. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small hidden room. Bare concrete walls. No windows. a single rusted chair in the corner, broken glass on the floor, and along one wall, a rough wooden shelf stacked with personal items. A woman's purse, a phone with a cracked screen, a silver necklace with a small heart pendant, and a photograph of Maya and her mother smiling together at a park. Ranger stopped in the center of the room. His tail lowered. His body tensed. Maya froze. Her eyes scanned the space slowly, as if recognizing something terrible. Then she moved. She walked straight toward the corner where the rusted chair sat. On the floor beside it lay another piece of fabric, torn, dirty, but unmistakably part of the same pink blanket. Maya dropped to her knees. Tears poured down her face. "Mommy was here," she whispered. Her voice echoed in the small room. Above them, reporters leaned over the stairwell, capturing every second, live streaming the moment to millions of viewers across America. In the courtroom, gasps turned into sobs. Collapsed to her knees, wailing. Reed stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. Two officers moved toward him instantly. "Sit down," the bailiff ordered. He didn't. His eyes were locked on the stairwell. In the hidden room, Officer Price scanned the walls with his flashlight. Scratches marred the concrete, deep, desperate claw marks. Near them, faint streaks of dried blood were visible. Helen felt her stomach twist. "This was a holding room," she whispered, "not storage." Ranger suddenly moved again. He trotted to the far wall, sniffing intensely near a small ventilation grate. His tail began wagging, not playfully, but alertly. Maya stood slowly, her tiny body trembling. She walked toward Ranger. Behind the grate, a faint noise came again. But this time, unmistakable. A weak human breath. Maya pressed her ear to the wall. Her lips trembled. "Mommy," she called softly. No answer. Only shallow breathing. Officer Price grabbed his radio. "We need immediate backup to Courtroom 7B, hidden basement access, possible live victim. I repeat, possible live victim." Above, chaos erupted. Jurors cried openly. Reporters shouted questions. Judge Harper slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the room was beyond control. Reed began shouting. "This is a setup, you planted this, you're framing me." Officers moved in, grabbing his arms. Inside the hidden room, Ranger sat beside Maya again, pressing against her like a shield. Helen knelt beside the child. "You did so good, Maya, you are so brave." Maya looked at her, tears streaming, but her voice was steady. "She's hurt," Maya said. Sirens wailed outside the courthouse, loud, urgent, overwhelming. Within minutes, firefighters, paramedics, and additional detectives poured into the building. Special tools were brought to break through the wall behind the grate. The pounding echoed through the basement. Each strike sent vibrations through the floor, up the stairs, and into the courtroom above. Maya clutched the torn blanket. Ranger stayed perfectly still. Then, with one final crash, the concrete gave way. Dust filled the air. Emergency lights flooded the hidden space. And through the broken wall, rescuers reached a small, cramped behind it. A woman lay curled inside. Bruised, bloodied, barely conscious, but breathing. Maya gasped. Her tiny legs gave out and she fell forward, but Ranger caught her balance, leaning his body against hers. Paramedics rushed in. One of them whispered, "She's alive." Above, the courtroom erupted into screams, not of fear but disbelief. Sobbed so hard she could barely breathe. Reed went silent. Dead silent. His face drained of all color. As paramedics carefully lifted the stretcher, Maya stood at the edge of staring at her mother's face. Her lips trembled. "Mommy," she whispered one last time. But even as hope filled the room, a new wave of tension washed over everyone. Because the woman was alive, but gravely injured. And the truth of what had happened to her was still buried in shadows. As officers escorted Reed out of the courtroom in handcuffs, cameras flashed like lightning. And in that moment, one haunting question echoed across every television screen in America. What had really happened down here, and how long had she been trapped? The courthouse trembled with noise. Sirens, shouts, and the echo of boots on marble floors blended into a chaotic storm that matched the rain still hammering the windows outside. Courtroom 7B no longer resembled a place of law. It felt like the center of a national emergency. Paramedics moved quickly but carefully, lifting Maya's mother onto a stretcher in the hidden basement. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, her body marked with bruises that told a story too cruel for words. An oxygen mask covered her face, fogging with each shallow breath. Maya stood frozen at the edge of the broken wall. Her small hands trembled, still clutching the torn pink blanket inside the plastic evidence bag. Ranger sat pressed tightly against her side, acting like a living shield between the child and the chaos. Upstairs, the courtroom had descended into utter disorder. Jurors were crying openly. Some sat with their heads in their hands, others stared in stunned silence. Reporters spoke rapidly into cameras, describing every moment in breathless detail as millions of Americans watched live. Judge Harper remained on his bench, standing now, not sitting, gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles were white. "This court will remain in session," he shouted over the noise. "We are not abandoning procedure even in crisis." His voice cracked, but his authority cut through the chaos like steel. Two bailiffs escorted Reed toward the holding area. He was no longer calm. His perfectly pressed suit now looked wrinkled and crooked. His face was drained of color, his jaw trembling. As officers placed handcuffs on his wrists, he began to shout. "You planted her," he yelled. "This is a setup, you staged this, I never touched her." But no one believed him anymore. Not after what had just been uncovered beneath their feet. Downstairs, detectives fanned out across the hidden room, photographing every inch of the space. Flashbulbs popped repeatedly as they documented the rusted chair, the blood-streaked walls, the torn fabric, and the personal belongings scattered on the wooden shelf. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter stood beside Maya, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt slowly. "Maya," she said softly, voice trembling despite her effort to stay professional. "You did something incredible today. You saved your mommy." Maya did not respond. Her eyes were locked on the stretcher as paramedics lifted up the narrow stairwell. One paramedic whispered into his radio, "Victim is alive but critical. Multiple injuries. Possible dehydration and trauma." As Face passed through the doorway, Maya reached out instinctively. "Mommy," she cried. For the first time since entering the courtroom, her voice was loud, desperate, shattering the air. Ranger let out a low, emotional whine. Collapsed into tears again, clutching the railing above the stairwell as she watched her daughter being carried past. "I knew she was alive, I knew it," she sobbed. Suddenly, footsteps thundered into the courtroom. A team of state detectives burst through the doors, led by Detective, a veteran investigator known for solving some of Virginia's most brutal cases. He scanned the scene quickly, courtroom, stairwell, broken wall, frantic officers, then turned to Judge Harper. "Your Honor," said urgently, "we just received breaking information from our field team." The judge leaned forward. "Speak." His voice was steady, but his face was grim. "We located a vehicle tied to this case, a gray pickup registered to Reed, parked near a wooded riverbank outside Richmond." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped speaking. Continued. "Inside the truck, we found traces of blood matching DNA and Maya's name carved into the dashboard." Gasps exploded through the room. Screamed. Jurors looked horrified. Reed snapped his head toward the detective. "That's a lie," he shouted. "I let her borrow that truck weeks ago." Officers tightened their grip on him. Downstairs, Maya's small body began to shake. She pressed herself harder against Ranger, as if the dog were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned terrifying. Helen stood slowly, her expression hardening. "Your Honor, this changes everything. The evidence suggests premeditation." Judge Harper exhaled slowly, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. "Proceed with extreme caution, Detective. This case has already crossed lines we never imagined." Nodded and turned to his team. "Move the search perimeter to the river immediately. Bring K-9 units, dive teams, and drones." Outside, helicopter blades began to roar. Within minutes, the courthouse was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles, news vans, and flashing lights. Search teams prepared to head into the woods along the riverbank where Reed's truck had been found. Back in the hidden basement room, Ranger suddenly became restless. His ears twitched. His body tensed. He began packing in tight circles around Maya. Officer Daniel Price noticed instantly. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ranger moved toward the broken wall again, not into but along the far side of the room, sniffing intensely at the concrete floor. Maya followed him without hesitation. Step by tiny step. Helen watched closely, heart racing. Ranger stopped near a dark stain on the floor, almost invisible in the dim light. He pawed at it gently, then looked up at Maya. She knelt beside him. Her small finger traced the edge of the stain. Her breath hitched. Slowly she turned toward the main courtroom, pointed upward toward Reed now being escorted out, and whispered one single, chilling word. "Bad." The word echoed faintly through the stairwell. Upstairs, it carried just enough for people to hear. The jury went pale. Reporters gasped. Judge Harper slammed his gavel instinctively. Reed froze. For a brief moment, rage flashed across his face, pure, unfiltered fury, before officers dragged him out of sight. Outside, sirens wailed louder. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the rain as teams prepared to comb the riverbank and surrounding woods. Inside, the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Maya rose slowly, clutching the pink blanket against her chest. Ranger stood at her side, protective and alert. Helen stepped beside her. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Suddenly, Officer Price's radio crackled to life. A tense voice came through. "Command to all units, we have movement near the river. Repeat, possible activity in the wooded area." The courtroom held its breath. Jurors leaned forward. Judge Harper's eyes widened slightly. Detective grabbed his radio. "Send live feed to the courtroom screens now." Within seconds, giant monitors flickered on along the walls of courtroom 7B. Grainy drone footage filled the screens. Search teams moved through dense forest near the river, flashlights cutting through pouring rain. Mud churned beneath their boots. K-9 units barked in the distance. Then suddenly, one dog stopped, barked sharply, and began digging frantically at the base of a massive oak tree near the water's edge. The courtroom gasped again. Maya watched the screen, her small body trembling. Ranger stood rigid beside her, ears pointed straight up. Back on the screen, officers dropped to their knees, scraping away mud and leaves. Something pale appeared beneath the dirt. Fabric. Pink fabric. The same shade as Maya's blanket. A collective cry filled the courtroom. Screamed. Several jurors broke down in tears. Reed, now out of sight, could be heard shouting somewhere down the hall. Detective's voice filled the room. "Do not disturb the site. Secure the perimeter. Bring forensic team immediately. But just as everyone assumed the worst, Ranger snapped his head toward the opposite side of the room. He let out a sharp bark. Maya turned with him. On the screen, the drone suddenly shifted, zooming in on a different direction, deeper into the woods, where faint movement flickered between the trees. A heat signature. Alive. The courtroom froze. Ranger began pulling gently toward the back stairwell again. Maya followed without hesitation. Judge Harper leaned forward, eyes locked on the screens. Outside, search teams split, half staying by the oak tree, half racing toward the new signal. Rain poured harder. Thunder cracked overhead. Helicopters buzzed lower. And as Maya stepped back toward the hidden room entrance, Ranger leading the way, one unbearable question hung in the air. If it had been found alive in the basement, then whose pink blanket was buried by the river? And what were they about to discover next? The rain turned the world into a gray blur. From the courthouse windows, Courtroom 7B looked out onto a scene that felt more like a war zone than a city center. Police cruisers, forensic vans, fire trucks, ambulances, and news vehicles crowded every street. Helicopters circled low overhead, their rotors slicing through the storm with a deafening roar. Searchlights cut bright white paths across soaked pavement and trembling trees. Inside the courtroom, the giant screens showed a split image. On one side, the oak tree by the river, where officers were carefully brushing away layers of mud. On the other, deep woods farther inland, where a second search team raced toward a faint heat signature moving slowly between the trees. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the reporters who moments earlier had been shouting into microphones now stood silent, eyes glued to the screens. Downstairs in the hidden room, Maya sat on the concrete floor clutching the torn pink blanket. Her small body rocked gently back and forth. Ranger lay beside her, his massive head resting protectively on her knees. Paramedics had already carried out to a waiting ambulance. Sirens wailed as the vehicle sped toward Richmond General Hospital under police escort. Yet the nightmare was far from over. Detective stood at the front of the courtroom, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the monitors. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. In 30 years of policing, he had never seen a case twist so violently and so publicly in a matter of hours. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter stood near the jury box, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. Every instinct told her the truth was finally surfacing, but at a terrible cost. At the oak tree, the first search team worked with precision. Forensic officers wore gloves and kneeled in the mud, gently removing dirt with small brushes instead of shovels. A police K-9 stood nearby, barking intermittently, tail stiff. One officer leaned closer to the ground. His breath hitched. The camera zoomed in. Through the rain and mud, a fragment of fabric became clearer, pale pink, stained brown from earth and decay. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, covered her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. Her worst fear, that something worse than disappearance had occurred, loomed over her like a shadow she could no longer outrun. Judge Harper sat heavily in his chair, staring at the screen. For the first time, the seasoned jurist looked visibly shaken. "Careful," said into his radio. "Do not disturb the site. Treat this as a potential burial." A forensic tarp was placed around the area. Markers were set. Photos were taken from every angle. The rain kept falling. Then one officer slowly scraped more mud away. The pink fabric was no longer just a fragment. It was part of a larger piece, unmistakably the same blanket Maya had clutched in the evidence room. A collective gasp filled Courtroom 7B. Several jurors began crying openly. One man covered his face with his hands, unable to look. Maya, watching from the stairwell, suddenly let out a soft whimper. Ranger lifted his head instantly, nudging her gently with his nose as if to comfort her. Upstairs, Reed, now in a holding room, could be heard shouting through the walls. "This is a setup, you're framing me. That blanket was stolen from my house." No one believed him anymore. On the screen, officers carefully lifted the corner of the blanket. Underneath it, dark soil. Too dark. Too fresh. Too deliberate. One officer hesitated, his hands shaking. He looked up at the drone camera and nodded grimly. Exhaled slowly. "Bring the medical examiner." Thunder cracked violently outside, shaking the courthouse windows. Yet just as despair threatened to swallow the room, Ranger suddenly stood up. His ears shot straight up, eyes locking onto the opposite wall of the hidden room. He let out a sharp bark. Maya flinched, then slowly lifted her head. Her tear-filled eyes widened. Upstairs, on the second half of the split screen, the inland search team moved deeper into the woods. Trees twisted in the storm, branches whipping violently. Mud sucked at boots. Flashlights cut trembling beams through darkness. The drone feed flickered, then steadied. A glowing heat signature appeared between two massive boulders near a ravine. Alive. Moving. Weak but unmistakable. The courtroom inhaled sharply. Helen stepped forward. "That's not a body, that's a person." Grabbed his radio. "All units prioritize the heat signal. Move now." The inland team broke into a sprint. Rain battered their faces as they crashed through brush and over fallen logs. A second K-9 unit barked frantically, leading the way. Maya stood slowly. Ranger moved toward the stairwell again. Without hesitation, Maya followed him. Helen rushed after her. "Maya, stay with me." But the child didn't stop. She climbed the stairs with surprising determination, clutching the blanket tightly. Back in the courtroom, everyone watched in stunned silence as Maya and Ranger emerged from the basement, soaked in dust and emotion. She walked straight toward the giant screens. Tiny hand pressed against the glass, where the heat signature glowed. "Mommy," she whispered. At the ravine, search teams reached the boulders. One officer slipped, nearly tumbling into the drop. Another grabbed him just in time. The K-9 darted ahead, barking louder than ever. Then suddenly, the dog stopped. He sat and began whining. The camera zoomed closer. Between the rocks, partially hidden by branches and mud, a small opening appeared, a narrow crevice leading downward. A faint hand reached out. Trembling, dirty, bruised, but moving. The courtroom erupted. Screams, sobs, and shouts filled the air. Collapsed again, this time not in despair but disbelief. "Is that her? Is that?" someone shouted. Leaned toward the screen, eyes narrowing. "Hold position, call medical immediately." Officers knelt beside the crevice. One reached in carefully, speaking softly. A weak voice drifted from the ravine, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakably human. Paramedics rushed through the mud toward the site. Inside courtroom 7B, Maya's knees buckled. Ranger caught her balance, leaning his body against hers. Helen knelt beside the child, tears streaking her face. "She's alive, Maya, she's alive." Maya stared at the screen, tears pouring down her cheeks, but her lips trembled into the smallest broken smile. Yet the relief was fragile. Back at the oak tree, forensic officers continued their grim work. More fabric appeared beneath the mud. Not just blanket. Clothing. Dark cloth that did not belong to. Radio crackled again. "Command, we're finding additional material near the oak, possibly belonging to a second person." The courtroom went silent once more. The joy in the room evaporated instantly. Maya's smile faded. Ranger stiffened. Judge Harper leaned forward, second person. Nodded grimly. We may be dealing with more than one victim. On the inland feed, paramedics finally reached the crevice. They carefully pulled a woman free. Her face was bruised, her hair matted with mud, but she was alive barely and breathing. The camera zoomed in. For a split second, the entire nation believed this was. But then Helen gasped. That's not her. Froze. Jurors stared in confusion. Maya pressed her small face against the screen. The woman lifted her head weakly. Her eyes fluttered open. And through the storm, her cracked lips formed a single word that echoed faintly through every speaker in the courtroom. Help! The room went utterly still. His voice came through the radio again, sharper now. Command, we have recovered an unidentified female near the ravine. She is alive but critical. Judge Harper slowly removed his glasses. His hands trembled. Everyone turned toward Maya. She stood silently, gripping the blanket, staring at the unknown woman on the screen. Ranger remained perfectly still beside her, alert, protective, and unyielding. Outside, helicopters thundered overhead. Sirens wailed in every direction. Rain poured harder than ever. And as paramedics loaded the mysterious woman onto a stretcher, one chilling realization settled over the courtroom like ice. If this was, then who was she? And what other secrets were still buried in those woods? The storm outside the courthouse felt relentless, as if the sky itself refused to let this day end. Rain hammered the glass in thick, unbroken sheets. Thunder rolled so loudly that it rattled the walls of Courtroom 7B, shaking the lights overhead. Every few seconds, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the tense faces of jurors, lawyers, officers, and family members who no longer felt like they were inside a courtroom, but inside a nightmare unfolding in real time. The giant screens remained split. On the left, paramedics rushing the unidentified woman from the ravine toward a waiting ambulance, her body wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. On the right, forensic officers kneeling in the mud beside the oak tree, methodically uncovering more fabric buried beneath the earth. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Downstairs, the hidden room was now swarming with investigators, crime scene technicians, and forensic photographers. Yellow tape hung loosely across broken concrete. Bright floodlights turned the once shadowy basement into a harsh, sterile investigation site. Maya sat at the top of the stairwell, just outside the hidden room. Her legs dangled off the edge of a courthouse bench, too short to touch the floor. She still clutched the torn pink blanket inside the plastic evidence bag, holding it close to her chest like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Ranger lay beside her, head resting protectively on her knee. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room, alert, watchful, and deeply serious. Upstairs, detectives stood at the front of the courtroom, arms folded, staring intently at the screens. His mind raced. 2 possible victims. One hidden in a basement beneath a courthouse. Another pulled from a ravine miles away. And buried fabric near a riverbank that might belong to someone else entirely. Nothing about this case made sense anymore. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter stood near the jury box, her face pale but focused. She replayed every moment in her head, the evidence room, the hidden door, Maya's connection with Ranger, the discovery of and now this unknown woman in the woods. She leaned toward. "This isn't just one crime," she whispered. "This is something bigger." Nodded grimly. "Trafficking, serial offense, organized crime, we don't know yet." Behind them, Judge Harper sat heavily in his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. In all his years on the bench, He had never presided over anything remotely like this. Outside, another ambulance siren wailed as the unknown woman was loaded into the vehicle. The camera zoomed in one last time on her face. Bruised, swollen, pale, but alive. Then the feed cut to the oak tree. Forensic officers carefully lifted more mud away. What emerged was not just blanket. It was clothing, dark fabric, torn, soaked, and partially decomposed. One officer leaned closer. His face went ashen. He turned toward the drone camera and spoke quietly into his radio. "Command, we have what appears to be human remains beneath the fabric." A collective gasp ripped through Courtroom 7B. Cried out, clutching her chest. Several jurors stood abruptly, unable to contain their horror. Judge Harper slammed his gavel. "Order, order in this court." But his voice trembled. Maya flinched at the noise, pressing closer to Ranger. Downstairs, Helen rushed toward the stairwell, heart pounding. She knelt beside Maya again. "Maya, sweetheart," she said softly, carefully, "you're doing so good. You don't have to watch this if it's too scary." Maya shook her head. Her small eyes stayed glued to the screen above. Then suddenly, Ranger stood up. His body went rigid. His ears pointed straight toward the hidden room again. A low, uneasy growl rumbled in his chest. Officer Daniel Price noticed instantly. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered, stepping closer. Ranger did not bark. Instead, he walked deliberately back toward the broken wall of the hidden basement. Maya slid off the bench and followed him without hesitation. Helen rushed after her. "Maya, wait." But the child moved with purpose. Inside the hidden room, technicians paused their work. Ranger trotted toward the far wall, not the where had been found, but the opposite side of the room. He sniffed intensely along the concrete, moving slowly toward a rusted metal panel embedded in the wall. Maya walked beside him. She placed her tiny hand against the cold metal. Then, almost as if she understood, she tapped it twice. A faint hollow sound echoed from behind it. Officer Price frowned. That panel wasn't documented. Who had descended the stairs moments earlier stepped forward. "Remove it." Two officers at the edges with crowbars. The metal screeched as bolts tore free. With a final pull, the panel came loose. Behind it was another narrow cavity, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Dark, dusty, and leading deeper beneath the courthouse. Ranger immediately darted inside. "Maya, stay here," Helen shouted. But Maya followed again. Hesitated only a second before crawling in behind them, flashlight in hand. The passage was cramped and claustrophobic. The air smelled stale, untouched for years. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling, pooling beneath their knees. After several yards, the tunnel opened into a small underground chamber. Not a room. More like a forgotten maintenance space beneath the building. In the center sat an old wooden table. On it lay a small, battered recorder, the kind people used decades ago to dictate notes. Ranger walked straight to it and sat beside it. Maya approached slowly. Her tiny fingers hovered above the device. Picked it up carefully, pressing the play button. Static filled the space. Then a voice. A woman's voice. Weak. Terrified. "I don't know where I am. Please, please help me. I just want to see my baby again." The recording cut abruptly. Silence filled the chamber. Helen covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. "That's," she whispered. Maya gasped softly. Ranger lowered his head. Stared at the recorder in disbelief. This wasn't evidence. This was left behind. Upstairs, reporters narrated frantically as live cameras captured officers emerging from the basement with the recorder in an evidence bag. The courtroom buzzed again with shock and outrage. Reed, still in holding, began screaming through the walls. "You're planting things now. You're planting recordings." No one listened. Downstairs, Maya suddenly stood very still. Her breathing quickened. She turned toward Ranger and placed her small hand on his head again. Then she whispered something soft, urgent, emotional, too quiet for anyone to hear. Ranger lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then, without warning, he darted toward another corner of the chamber. Behind a stack of old pipes lay a battered backpack. Ranger nudged it with his nose. Maya walked toward it. She crouched down and slowly unzipped it. Inside were a woman's wallet, ID inside, a child's pacifier, a small photograph of Maya and her mother, and a crumpled handwritten note. Helen carefully unfolded the paper. Her voice trembled as she read aloud. "If I don't make it out, tell my daughter I never stopped fighting." The room went silent. Above, the courtroom erupted in sobs. Collapsed again, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Maya clutched the photo to her chest. Ranger sat beside her, unmoving. Took a deep breath. This proves she was held here and moved later. Upstairs, the screens flickered again. The oak tree site now showed medical examiners carefully removing remains wrapped in dark fabric. Radio crackled. Command 2 remains appear to be male, not. A stunned hush fell over the courtroom. Helen turned sharply. "Male." Nodded grimly. "Another victim." Maya looked up at Ranger. Then suddenly, she whispered again. "Mommy still breathing." Helen froze. Turned toward her. What did she say? Before Helen could answer, Officer Price's radio burst to life again. "Command, thermal drones picking up movement 2 miles east of the ravine. Repeat, new heat signal detected." The courtroom gasped. Judge Harper leaned forward. Another person. Grabbed his radio. "Send live feed immediately." The screens shifted. A new drone view appeared. Deep forest, thick fog, rain pounding leaves. A faint glowing shape moved slowly near a rocky hillside. Alive. Barely. Maya stood slowly. Her eyes widened. Ranger lifted his head instantly. Then, in a moment that stunned everyone watching, Maya turned toward the back of the courtroom, pointed toward the hidden stairwell and said clearly, "She's still out there." The room went completely silent. Stared at her. Helen felt chills race down her spine. On the screen, search teams began sprinting toward the new signal. Rain fell harder. Helicopters roared lower. Thunder crashed overhead. And as Maya took Ranger's leash in her tiny hand and started walking toward the courthouse exit, one terrifying question echoed across the nation. If was alive, and one unknown woman had been rescued, then who else was still lost in those woods? And how many lives were truly at risk? Night did not feel like night anymore. It felt like a living, breathing force pressing down on Richmond. The storm had intensified after sunset. Rain lashed the courthouse windows so violently that it sounded like glass might shatter at any moment. Lightning lit the sky in blinding white bursts, briefly turning Courtroom 7B into a stark, frozen photograph of grief, fear, and hope. Inside, the courtroom remained packed. No one had gone home. Jurors sat stiff and pale, some clutching tissues, others staring blankly at the giant screens mounted along the walls. Lawyers leaned over tables in hushed conversations that carried no comfort. Reporters whispered urgently into their microphones, knowing millions were still watching. Maya sat on the same bench near the stairwell. Her small legs no longer swung. They dangled lifelessly over the edge, barely moving. Her pink dress was smudged with dust from the basement. The torn blanket in the evidence bag rested on her lap like a fragile lifeline. Ranger lay beside her. His massive head rested against her thigh, his eyes half closed but alert. Every time thunder cracked, he pressed closer to her, not in fear but in protection. Downstairs, the hidden basement had become a full-scale crime scene. Yellow tape crisscrossed the broken walls. Bright floodlights illuminated every inch of the space where it had been found. Forensic technicians moved methodically, bagging items, marking stains, and photographing the secret tunnel that led to the underground chamber. Detective stood at the top of the stairwell, radio pressed to his ear. His voice was low but urgent. "Keep the thermal drones on that second signal. Do not lose it." On the courtroom screens, a live drone feed showed the woods east of the ravine. Trees bent violently in the storm. Mud turned to slick rivers beneath boots. Search teams moved in tight formation, flashlights cutting shaky beams through the darkness. A faint orange glow pulsed on the thermal camera, a human heat signature, weak but alive. Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter stood near Maya, watching both the child and the screen. Her heart felt heavy. Was alive barely, in a hospital bed somewhere across town. One unknown woman had been rescued from the ravine. A male body had been discovered buried near the river. And now another life flickered somewhere in the storm. "Who are you?" Helen whispered to herself as she stared at the glowing figure on the screen. Judge Harper remained on the bench. His face looked older than it had that morning. His shoulders sagged slightly, but his eyes were sharp, locked on the unfolding search. He tapped his gavel once, softly this time. "Court remains in recess," he said quietly, "but this room will not close." Outside, helicopters thundered overhead. Their searchlights swept across the forest in long, piercing beams that cut through rain like blades of light. On the screen, one search team paused near a steep hillside covered in slick rocks and tangled roots. The K-9 unit with them barked sharply, pulling at its leash. The heat signature was close now. Very close. Downstairs, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears shot straight up. Maya stirred. Her small hand slid from the blanket onto his fur. She whispered something again, soft, urgent, emotional words only the dog seemed to understand. Ranger stood immediately. His body tense, muscles coiled. Upstairs, turned toward the stairwell as Ranger began moving. "Stay here, Maya," Helen said gently. But Maya slid off the bench and followed him anyway. Step by tiny step, she walked beside the massive dog toward the courthouse doors. Bailiffs moved instinctively, then hesitated. No one dared to stop her. Not after everything she had already led them to. Outside, rain battered the stone steps of the courthouse. Police lights reflected off every wet surface, turning the world into a chaotic swirl of red, blue, and white. Ranger walked straight toward one of the waiting police SUVs. Officer Daniel Price opened the door without question. Maya climbed in first, without hesitation, pulling herself onto the seat and clutching the blanket tightly. Ranger jumped in beside her. Turned sharply, "Where are they going?" Price spoke quickly into his radio. "Ranger is leading, we follow." Sirens blared. The SUV lurched forward, tires splashing through flooded streets as a convoy of police vehicles followed. Inside the courtroom, the live feed shifted again, now showing a helicopter camera tracking the convoy toward the forest. Jurors leaned forward, clutched her hands together in prayer. The convoy tore down slick roads, then veered onto a muddy trail at the edge of the woods. Vehicles skidded but pushed on. Rain hammered the windshield, so hard visibility dropped to almost nothing. Inside the SUV, Maya sat perfectly still. Her eyes stared straight ahead into the storm. Ranger stood with his nose pressed against the window, ears twitching at every sound. At the hillside, search teams moved cautiously. The ground was treacherous, loose rocks sliding beneath boots, roots slick with rain. The thermal glow flickered again. Closer now. One officer slipped, nearly tumbling down a ravine before being pulled back. Then suddenly, the K9 stopped. It sat. Silent. Ears pointed. The heat signature was directly beneath them. A shallow cave carved into the hillside came into view, partially hidden by vines and fallen branches. Flashlights pierced the darkness. Inside, a figure lay curled against the rock wall, barely moving. The officer called out softly, "Police, can you hear me?" No response. Only shallow breathing. Just then, the police SUV screeched to a stop at the base of the hill. Doors flew open. Maya slid out first. Mud soaked her shoes instantly. Ranger leapt out beside her and began climbing the hill without hesitation. "Wait," Helen shouted, racing after them. But Maya was already moving, faster than anyone expected. She reached the cave opening. Her small body trembled as she stepped inside. The beam of a flashlight revealed a woman lying on her side. Her clothes were torn. Her skin was pale and bruised. Her hair matted with mud. Maya froze. Ranger stepped forward and gently licked the woman's hand. Her fingers twitched. A faint breath escaped her lips. Maya knelt beside her. Tears streamed down her face as she placed the pink blanket over the woman's shoulders. "Wake up," Maya whispered. Paramedics rushed in seconds later. They checked her pulse, placed an oxygen mask, and began stabilizing her for transport. One medic whispered urgently, "She's alive but extremely weak." Arrived moments later, breathless. He crouched beside Maya. "Who is she?" he asked softly. Maya did not look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on the woman's face. Then very quietly she spoke. "Mommy's friend." A chill ran through everyone who heard. Helen stared at Maya. "Friend." Maya nodded slowly. Above them, thunder cracked so loudly the hillside seemed to shudder. The woman stirred again. Her cracked lips parted. One word slipped out, barely audible. The courtroom screens showed everything. Gasps filled courtroom 7B. Covered her mouth in shock. Judge Harper leaned forward, eyes wide. Paramedics carefully lifted the woman onto a stretcher. As they carried her down the hill, helicopters hovered overhead, lights blazing through the storm. Back in the cave, Ranger paced restlessly, sniffing every corner. Then he stopped near the back wall. His tail stiffened. He barked once. Officer Price moved forward, shining his flashlight where Ranger stood. Carved into the rock were faint letters, scratched desperately into stone. Yelena was here. Helen's breath caught. Stared at the wall, jaw tight. Below that, another line read, "He took others." The words hung in the air like a curse. Back in courtroom 7B, silence fell so heavy it felt unbearable. Thence radio crackled again. "Command to hospital reports is conscious. She is asking for her daughter." A wave of relief swept the room. Maya's shoulders sagged. For the first time all day, a tiny breath that almost sounded like a laugh escaped her. Ranger pressed closer to her. But the relief was fragile. On the oak tree site, forensic teams continued their grim work through the night. More remains were uncovered, fragments of clothing, bones, and personal items. His expression darkened as his radio buzzed again. Preliminary ID suggests the buried male may have been reported missing last year. Another life. Another victim. Another family shattered. Rain continued to fall. Sirens echoed in the distance. Paramedics loaded the rescued woman into an ambulance, sirens blaring as they sped toward the same hospital where lay. Inside Courtroom 7B, the giant screens flickered. The search was still active. Helicopters still circling. Teams still combing the woods. Maya stood at the edge of the hillside, staring into the storm as the ambulance disappeared into the night. Ranger sat beside her, unmoving. Then Maya turned slowly toward the camera, toward the world watching her. Her small face was streaked with tears. Her voice was soft but clear. "There are more." The words rippled through Courtroom 7B like ice. Judge Harper removed his glasses, hands trembling. Helen felt her stomach twist. Looked out at the dark forest, rain pounding relentlessly. Helicopters roared. Dogs barked. Searchlights cut through the night. And as midnight approached, one chilling truth settled over everyone watching. The rescue was not the end. It was only the beginning. Dawn did not arrive gently. It ripped through the horizon like a blade. The storm that had terrorized Richmond for nearly 24 hours finally began to break, but the sky was still bruised, streaked with gray and purple clouds that refused to release their grip. From above, the forest looked like a battlefield. Helicopters circled in slow, relentless loops. Searchlights still pierced the trees. Police vehicles lined every road, every dirt trail, every clearing. Reporters clustered behind barricades, broadcasting live to millions who had stayed awake all night. Inside Courtroom 7B, no one had slept. Coffee cups littered the benches. Tired jurors rubbed their eyes. Bailiffs stood stiffly at the doors. Cameras remained trained on the giant screens that displayed the continuing search. Judge Harper returned to his bench as the first rays of morning filtered through the tall windows. His voice, though exhausted, carried authority. "This court remains open," he said. "We will not look away." Downstairs, the hidden basement, the nightmare beneath the courthouse, had become the most meticulously examined crime scene in the state's history. Forensic teams worked through the night, extracting soil samples, analyzing fibers, mapping the tunnel, and reconstructing a timeline that made seasoned detectives physically sick. Near the ravine, where the first woman had been found, investigators discovered more buried items. A shoe, a torn jacket, a rusted necklace engraved with a name that no longer belonged to the living. At the oak tree site, the truth became undeniable. More remains were located. Not just one victim. Not two. But several. The realization settled like a dark fog over everyone involved. This was not a single crime. It was a long, hidden pattern of violence that had been buried for years. Detective stood near the tree, rain-soaked and hollow-eyed. His radio buzzed constantly with updates, each one heavier than the last. "Command 2, the rescued woman from the cave is stable. She is asking for the child." Closed his eyes for a brief moment. Maya, 3 years old, and somehow the center of everything. Back at the courthouse, Maya sat once again on the same bench near the stairwell. She looked smaller than ever. Her pink dress was dirty, her hair was tangled, but her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were still sharp, still aware, still searching. Ranger lay beside her, his massive body pressed protectively against her legs. Every time a door opened or footsteps echoed, his ears twitched. Maya's grandmother sat beside her now, arms wrapped tightly around the little girl. She had not stopped crying since learning that was awake and asking for her daughter. On the screens, live footage showed paramedics rolling the rescued woman, now identified as, into the same hospital where lay. As she was wheeled inside, she lifted her head weakly and whispered again. Inside Courtroom 7B, Assistant District Attorney Helen Carter watched in silence. Her case had shifted overnight. What had once been a custody battle and a missing persons case had become something far larger, a revelation of systemic evil hidden beneath their own city. Then the phone call came. His voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. Is fully conscious, she is speaking. A collective breath filled the room. On a split screen, cameras showed in a hospital bed, pale, bruised, but alive. An oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. Bandages wrapped her arms, but her eyes burned with clarity. A nurse adjusted the microphone near her pillow, looked directly at the camera. Then she spoke. He kept us underground. Her voice trembled, but it was steady. He had rooms, hidden rooms, not just the basement under the courthouse. Others, tunnels connecting places people walk every day. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harper leaned forward, gripping the edge of his bench. Swallowed hard. He chose women who would not be missed quickly. Homeless women, runaways, immigrants without family nearby, people the city had already forgotten. Tears streamed down her face. And she saved me. On the hillside, footage showed being treated, now wrapped in blankets, her face turned toward a helicopter circling above. Back in the courtroom, hugged Maya. Maya watched the screen intently. Her small fingers twisted in Ranger's fur. Continued. He called himself a guardian of justice. He said he was punishing women the system failed, but he was a monster. The room fell utterly silent. Then spoke into his radio. Send teams to every municipal basement, every maintenance tunnel, every abandoned access point beneath the city. Now. Within hours, searches expanded across Richmond. Police descended into subway tunnels, storm drains, forgotten utility corridors, and sealed off government buildings. In one location, beneath an old public library, they found a locked steel door hidden behind a false wall. Inside, another small room. Empty now, but stained. At another site, beneath a city parking garage, they discovered a ventilation shaft that led to a narrow tunnel. Footprints. Fresh. And near them, a discarded raincoat. On the screen, a thermal drone suddenly picked up movement near the riverbank. A lone figure running through mud. Police closed in fast. Helicopters descended lower. Within minutes, the man was surrounded. He dropped to his knees without resistance. Handcuffs snapped into place. Reporters screamed his name before anyone confirmed it. Michael Ardent, former city maintenance supervisor. A man who had worked beneath the city for years. A man who had keys, access, trust, and secrets no one had ever questioned. Back in courtroom 7B, Maya watched his arrest on the screen. Her face did not change. No fear. No anger. Only a quiet, heavy understanding beyond her years. Entered the courtroom moments later, soaked and exhausted. He walked straight to Maya and knelt beside her. Maya, he said softly, you saved lives. She looked at him, then at Ranger, then back at the screen. Finally, she spoke. He tried to take more. Her words chilled the room. Nodded slowly, we found them because of you. On the screens, footage showed rescue teams locating 2 more women in a hidden tunnel near the river, alive, terrified but breathing. Ambulances rushed in. Sirens wailed. Lives were pulled back from the brink. Inside the hospital, held hand through glass as doctors worked to stabilize her. Both women cried. Not just in pain, but in survival. In the courtroom, Judge Harper stood. His voice echoed across the chamber. Today, this child did more than most adults ever will. She exposed darkness where we refuse to look. He turned toward Maya. Your courage will change this city. Maya did not smile. She simply rested her head against Ranger's side. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting pale gold light across the courthouse steps. Rain still dripped from rooftops, but the storm was retreating. Yet the emotional storm inside Richmond had only begun. Weeks later, in a montage that played across every news channel, the aftermath unfolded. A citywide investigation uncovered 3 hidden underground sites. Michael Ardent was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and abuse. Families of missing women came forward, many crying as photos were displayed on screens. New laws were proposed to inspect all municipal underground spaces annually. Ranger received a special medal from the police department, standing proudly beside Maya. In a final courtroom scene months later, Maya sat again on the same bench. Clean dress, neat hair, Ranger at her feet. Sat in the gallery, fully recovered, holding his hand beside her. Michael Ardent was brought in wearing handcuffs. As he passed Maya, he stopped. For the first time, his calm facade cracked. He looked afraid. Maya looked up at him, small, steady, unshaken. She did not flinch. He was led away. Judge Harper read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in tears, applause, and trembling relief. Outside, reporters swarmed. But Maya did not speak to them. She walked down the courthouse steps with her mother, Ranger close behind. At the bottom, she paused. She turned back toward the building that had once hidden so much darkness beneath its polished floors. She knelt and placed her tiny hand on Ranger's head. Then she whispered something no one else could hear. Ranger lifted his gaze toward the sky. Sunlight poured over them both. And in that quiet moment, the city seemed to breathe again. But as the camera pulled back, drifting high above Richmond, one final image appeared on screen. A drone hovering over the forest. Search teams still moving. Flashlights still sweeping. Because even with justice served, some shadows never fully disappear. And somewhere beneath the earth, another secret might still be waiting. The screen faded to black. Then one final line appeared. Courage has no age.